our independent kind of modern state of Israel. And so we've gotten this independent state. We fought against the Greeks. This is post Alexander the Great. And we're really excited to have a Jewish state. And one of the main things at the beginning is that we don't have a king, because Judaism very specifically states in the Talmud that we don't have kings. We have leaders, but our king is gone. But very quickly, the influence of the Greeks and the Romans starts to sink in this area. And the names we see of leaders is a clear influence of this. So we go from very Jewish names to names like Hyrcanos, Aristobulus. So we see already this kind of impact of Greece and then Rome. There is a civil war in this area between two rival brothers who both want what has now become a kingship. And they're fighting over this and they don't know who to decide. So they turn to one of their advisors whose name is Antipater. And they say, how do we figure this out? How do we decide who gets to be king without going to a huge war? And Antipater is an interesting character because he is what we call an Idumean. And Judaism doesn't believe in conversion. We don't force convert anybody, right? You can convert if you want, but it's very specific in Jewish history that you don't convert people. You don't make them convert. But there was a time in a brief period of time in this chaos that a small group of non-Jews were forced to convert. They're called Idumeans. So these people were taken up and there was, if you want to be part of this area, you must convert or die. And Antipater was one of these forced converts. So he was a Roman citizen who was forced converted to Judaism, which gives him kind of an interesting view, right? Is he, really consider himself Jewish or not? But he's the guy who gets to decide what's going to happen at the end of the Civil War. And he turns towards Rome. Now in Rome at the time, we have Pompey, who is kind of leading the main Roman charge. And Pompey says, hey, guess what? I'm going to come in and I'm going to solve the problem for you. I'm going to bring in a military and I'm going to put in who's going to be king. And he chooses Herod. Who is Herod? Herod is actually Antipater's son. So this is kind of how the whole, world works, right? You get into power and you put your son into power. So Herod is an interesting character because he is, on the one hand, a Jew, but remember his father was a forced convert. So he's Jewish, but kind of Jew-ish, right? He doesn't really belong kind of in the Jewish world. Now, why was Pompey so excited to have control over this land? If we look at the map of the Roman Empire, this is a little bit later than what I'm talking about. This land of what is today, Israel, the land bridge between Africa and Europe. So we have the Mediterranean, but if we want to get stuff over land, this is a good place to control. So that's why he really wants to put Roman control in this area. Now, Herod's not stupid. Herod knows that if he's going to be king of the Jews, if he's going to rule this area, he needs viability. So he marries the granddaughter of the royal family, Mariam. He marries her, and that's kind of his connection to the throne. Now, Herod is an interesting character. The first thing he does is he wants to take Judea from this backwoods, random little spot into the modern day, right? He wants us to be the greatest area of the Roman Empire besides Rome itself. So he begins to focus on building. And his building projects are both Jewish themed and more Roman, themed, general themed. So the first thing he does is he focuses on the Cave of the Patriarchs. The Cave of the Patriarchs is the supposed burial site of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, right? The forefathers of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam, some of them. And so he says, we're going to make this spot a really holy spot with a really fancy building. And that is a goal of, the one hand, to bring the Jews to like him, right? He wants control of the people. And he says, I don't want to force my way in. I want them to like me. So that is one of his new building projects, okay? Turns the site on Masada. Now, Masada is probably one of the most well-known of his building sites. It is a mountain out by the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea is the lowest point on earth. And he chose it because Herod is highly, highly scared of an overthrow. And he needs a place to go to escape in case of times of war where no one can get to him. And Masada is a great location for that. It's really out in the middle of nowhere. It was on a major road-ish, but it was on a high mountain. There was only one path up, and the path up was a little tiny snake path that went back and forth. So in times of war, you can bring a whole army up the top. On top, he builds 2 castles, 2 palaces. The one you see on the right side, this is the northern palace, actually down the front face of the mountain, right? He literally like carves it in. Again, if you can imagine, he has hundreds of thousands of slaves carrying rocks up, you know, one by one by one by one, just to build this. And again, of these little tiny paths. And he makes this a really beautiful site. He's got a beach front, you know, it's the Dead Sea, but he's right on the edge of the water. And he is putting all his focus there. He also builds a great big Roman bath. Again, he's in the middle of the lowest place on earth. It's desert, it's really hot. There's literally no water on top of the mountain, but he still focuses on building a full Roman bath. You can see here part of the caldarium, right, the hot bath with the pipes in the walls and the space for fire underneath. And again, it was a sign of his Romanness, right? That he was going to build this great Roman bath, even on the top of a great big mountain. I want you to notice on the mosaic here, anyone who's looked at Roman mosaics, do you notice anything interesting about this particular, about this mosaic in general, why it might be different than what you might expect to see in a kind of Roman palace? Anyone think about Roman mosaics? Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is right, but it looks very like curved and circular, and I feel like it's sort of unusual.
Okay. Anything else? I can't hear you. I think Matthew's talking, but I can't hear what you're saying. I don't know if that's me or
Can you hear me now?
Now I can, yes.
There you go. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I was gonna say a similar thing to Joshua, that it looked more geometric, you know, with like the hearts in the center, and like, you know, the triangles there on the edges, more than like the Roman mosaics.
Good. So we see geometric shapes. We don't see humans and animals in any mosaic, basically, that Herod will put out. Anyone know why this might be? Anyone know anything about Judaism?
Does he not want to confuse it with like fables?
So
False idols?
What?
False idols?
That's it, exactly. False idols, right? Judaism believes that you shouldn't put, you know, images of people or animals in places that might be seen as worship, right? So this idea, if we put humans into mosaics, this is kind of idol worship. So nowhere in his shapes. Sorry, someone go back on mute. Whoever's on mute. Nowhere in his shapes will you see people or animals. So again, this kind of nod to his Judaism, even if he's not very Jewish.
He was fucking celebrating your losing, bro.
Not on mute. Okay, so on the one hand, he's very, very Roman. We see the Roman baths. On the other hand, he's also, you know, keeping this kind of, you know, we don't want to do anything to piss off the Jews because that's who he's, you know, ruler of, right? His second major building project is the city of Caesarea. And this is something really important to Herod because this area of Palestine doesn't have good major ports, okay? We have one kind of port in, let's say, Haifa, one kind of port in, let's say, Ashdod, but they're not deep water ports. And Herod knows if he wants to make this area a great economic center, he needs a way to trade, okay? So he does something baffling, okay? He literally builds himself a port, a deep water port. He brings over 44 shiploads of concrete, basically, of this type of volcanic ash that was put into concrete. That's 44 shiploads of more than 400 tons each. Okay, so we're talking mass amounts of things he's bringing over from Italy to build this port. And he you can kind of see what he does on the left. So he builds a big major city, an economic center. This will later on become the capital when it becomes Syria Palestina after much long after Herod, but later on. And he builds a deep water port for ships. Today, it's not quite so simple. If you're interested in underwater archaeology, you can actually, there is a underwater museum site where you can dive down and see the ruins of what is left of the port. The problem Herod didn't quite understand, two problems. One, he built it right on the fault line. Israel is on a fault line, and so he built it right where the earthquakes happen. That's kind of an issue that will destroy it later on. And also, for some reason, the type of rock that exists under the sea here in Israel is different than in Italy, and the concrete that he brought didn't stick the same kind of way he expected it to stick as it did in Italy. So kind of a really great idea. It lasted, again, for about 100 years really well, and then it kind of slowly deteriorated, disintegrated into the water. You can still see parts of it today, but it's not quite the greatness it was. Still today, though, you can still see the Colosseum, the Hippodrome, again, these kind of centers of Roman life, this, bringing in Roman ideals into Israel. There's another bit of the port, kind of, you can see what's left of it in the dark bits on the left, right? He built at a big breakwater. Here's the Hippodrome today. They actually do horse races here. During Passover, they do horse races around the area. Okay, his kind of greatest crowning achievement when it comes to architecture is what we know as the Second Temple, or today is part of the Western Wall. And Judaism believes that this spot is the spot where King Solomon was meant to build the house of God, right? And he built the first temple. The first temple was destroyed. Now we're building the second temple. Now, this temple was built on a mountain called Mount Moriah. It's actually a little tiny mountain. And Herod said, I want to build the greatest temple known to man. I want to build something that no one's ever seen before. But how do you build a great big mountain on a little tiny peak? So what Herod did is he actually shaved off the top part of the mountain, and he built, you can kind of see it in the bottom picture here, he built kind of into the mountain and then around the mountain and added in a retaining wall, which he filled with dirt, and then created a great big platform across the top. So he created a fake top of the mountain. And the things we're talking about are huge. Again, we're talking about a time before cars and planes and all that sort of fun stuff. The largest piece of stone that you can see here on the left is 45 feet by 11 feet by 16 and a half feet. It weighed about 600 tons, which, if we can think about it, an elephant weighs 7 tons-ish. An Airbus A380 at its max takeoff weight is about 575 tons. So we're looking at a huge piece of stone that they brought from the quarry down to build this mountain, mostly through a system of pulleys and rolling on wooden logs, but a very, very complicated system. So he built this great big temple. And again, this was like the center of life in Judaism. And in it, on top of it, he built a magnificent piece. So here's an image of the temple, of what he built. You can see in the center is the Holy of Holies, right? There's a great big marble center with an area that would be for the Ark of the Covenant. And then around it, a center for sacrifice. And beyond that, you can see the rest of the city. I want you to notice also, this is a slightly later section, on the right, you can see kind of an extra 4 towers. That was a Roman garrison. So again, this kind of like we're building this great big temple, and the Romans are still kind of sitting on our sides. So he builds this great big temple. And again, this is the kind of thing that from far away you could see for miles and miles and miles, full of gold, really, really shining, and just kind of a center of focus for the Jews and also for the non-Jews, right? A sign of celebration. In Judaism, at this point, there were 3 pilgrimage holidays. Okay, so 3 times a year, the city of Jerusalem and this area specifically would fill up with hundreds of thousands of Jews who would travel from all over the Middle East to make sacrifices to God. So this was a huge center of tourism. There were kind of early hotels, lots of food selling. It was a major also economic center. So those are kind of his big building charges. He builds these great big things. He's changing the center of what Israel looks like, right? From this kind of backwater to now we've got a major economic center, a major religious center, right? We are now kind of up and coming in the Roman Empire. But I want to talk about Herod as a leader for a second and as a person beyond this. He, as I said before, he marries Miriam. He marries this granddaughter of the Maccabees. In 37. Now, her brother was the high priest, right, which is a role of respect in Judaism. And after a year, he has him murdered because he's scared that the Jewish people like him more, the high priest, than Herod, right? That's how nervous he is about his control. He has a lot of kids by Miriam, and then he gets really, really jealous because she's beautiful, and he hears rumors that she's cheating on him. And it goes so far that he puts her on trial, kills her, and then embalms her in a vat of honey to keep by his bed for 7 years. There is some discussion as to whether or not he might have slept with her during that period, whether he's necrophilia or not, probably not, but the Jewish rabbis have written lots of discussions about how terrible he was with the dead body of his wife. After he kills his wife and embalms her in honey, he kills his other brother-in-law because he's worried again that someone's going to overthrow him. His eldest son, when he becomes of age, he has him killed also because he's worried that he'll overthrow him. If you follow the story of Jesus in the Gospels, they talk about the fact that Herod probably murdered hundreds of babies when he heard about this coming of Jesus. This leader that would overthrow him. Probably not true, but he killed plenty of people out of fear of being overthrown, even if it wasn't large amounts of kids. So on the one hand, he's doing this great, building, he's changing the face. On the other hand, he is very clearly a tyrant. He is murdering people left, right, and center. And he's kind of this two-faced, right? Things, I guess, come to people. There's kind of a karma here, though. He will die in what is today Jericho, probably of a long, extended, socially transmitted disease. There is a very long discussion in the Jewish Talmud of his death with lots of fun details. It describes it as intense itching, painful intestinal problems, convulsions in every limb, and gangrene of the genitals. Could have been something like today gonorrhea, but definitely not a nice way to die. At the time, of course, the Romans strongly believed in balancing biles, right? Your balance of your humors. And so in order to heal him from this, his physicians actually put him in a vat of boiling oil. So that didn't particularly help. It actually made him blind for a period of time. So again, didn't particularly help him get healthy, but that's why he will die. Before he dies, he writes in his will and he makes his second in command promise that on the day he dies, they will take all of the most popular rabbis and leaders into a Colosseum and have them all murdered because he's afraid that no one will mourn him after his death, and he wants people to mourn something and him as proxy, I guess. And so he demands this be carried out so that someone will cry for him. In the end, of course, thank God, his son, who does take over after he dies, and his sister do not follow through with this. So although he will die, that he was the only one who dies. And that will kind of be the end of Herod. So again, there's this kind of period here that we're talking about in which the Romans, Herod as a representative, they're coming in and pushing in Roman ideals. And this is something that is a huge challenge in this time period for Herod and for other leaders also, is that Jewish values and Roman values are kind of opposite to each other in every way. If we think about the ideas of modesty, if we think about the very idea of circumcision, which is such kind of a focal point in Jewish history, Jewish life, and this Roman ideal of kind of the section of the body in the circumcision was a kind of a sinful act for the Romans, right? How could you mar the human body, which is something so divine in so many senses? And so Herod tried to balance that line of bringing the Jews under his goal while still keeping this kind of Roman mentality. And that was a challenge. The Jews tend to speak of him, in history as a terrible tyrant. Although when we think about tourism in Israel and coming to visit here, the top places you go and see are all Herod's creations, right? Masada and Caesarea, Herodium, the Cave of the Patriarchs. These are all things that he built. So it's no question that he changed the face of Israel, both in the ancient world and the modern world. But he also was not a very good ruler. After his death, the Romans will put in the Roman procurators. This is during the beginning of the time of Jesus. They basically give up on this idea of a Jewish king and say, no, you must become part and parcel of the Roman Empire, run by ex-governor, by ex-military leaders, and that will lead to my next class. If anyone wants to stay along for that, we will talk about kind of the Jewish reaction to that. Questions, comments? Yes, Matthew.
Were there any major prophets during Herod's reign, like in the Old Testament, like any minor or major prophets?
So the prophets are pre this. In Jewish Testament basically ends. So the story of Hanukkah, which is Greek, is already post kind of the Testaments, right? We basically pre-Assyrian kind of is where we get Babylonian. That's kind of the period that we end the prophets. So no major prophets at this point. Yeah. That's a whole Delver class in itself. Other questions or thoughts? Okay. Herod is a really interesting character. I do encourage you, if you ever come to this area, but also if you are bored, this kind of question of what makes a good leader, and then what makes leaders go crazy is always kind of an interesting discussion, I think. So if you have a personal question, you're welcome to hang around. If you're hanging out for my next class, you're welcome to hang around, and I'm happy to answer any other questions, even if it's just more general about what I do or about life here in Israel, teaching classics. I'm happy to answer.